HMCS Bonaventure was Canada's third and last proper carrier, at least so far. And she has special significance to at least one subscriber who got in contact with me seeing that the ship was on the list for review and kindly provided these pictures showing his father serving aboard said carrier. Like her predecessor, HMCS Magnificent, she was a Majestic-class aircraft carrier, and as it turned out, all of Canada's major carriers would come from the same dockyard in Belfast, the Harland and Wolff yards having turned out the Warrior and then later built Magnificent and Powerful alongside each other. This last ship would be laid down in November 1943 and launched in February 1945, but with the end of the war, the ship was incomplete when work stopped in May 1946. This proved to be an unintentionally wise choice, since when the Royal Canadian Navy faced the problem of having traded in Warrior for Magnificent, as the former vessel couldn't operate the larger and heavier last-generation propeller-driven aircraft, but now found Magnificent was not able to comfortably operate the wide range of jet aircraft being deployed to carrier forces in the 1950s, they found that there were options on the table. The US Navy was prepared to loan 2 of their Essex-class carriers. The US, of course, could spare a couple of its vast carrier fleet and still be feared. The Royal Navy was prepared to sell one of the Centaur class, the bigger and more capable successors to the Majestics. But both of these options just cost too much money, whilst the completion and purchase of the slightly smaller Powerful, with jet-specific modifications, was affordable, and so that was the choice they went with. This would also make her the only carrier Canada actually outright owned, as opposed to the previous ships, which had been on a long-term loan. Work on Powerful started back up again, installing an angled flight deck, new steam catapults, an optical landing system, larger aircraft lifts, further strengthening to the flight deck, and a number of American systems, including various radars and 3-inch automatic AA guns, in place of the originally planned 40mm Bofors, reflecting the longer range and higher speed of new aerial threats. The funnel was also raked back at a nice-looking angle, and new electronics were supported on a modern lattice mast. Refinements to the machinery also meant that although her standard displacement of 16,000 tons was 1,000 tons more than her predecessor, and she was also 6 foot longer, she was actually half a knot faster at 24.5 knots. With all these changes completed, she was commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy in 1957 and renamed from Powerful to Bonaventure, heading for Canada after working up her air group, with the experimental hydrofoil Brasse d'Or perched rather jauntily on her flight deck for the journey. Although her deck space was greater than her predecessors, the overall air group went down due to the ever-increasing size of carrier-based aircraft. She would be equipped at the start of her service with F-2H Banshees and CS-2F trackers, alongside the H-04S helicopter. Like her electronics, the air group reflected Canada's gradual drift towards aligning with American equipment rather than British. Despite the upgrades, the jets still barely fit aboard, and although the flight deck was just over 700 feet long, it was still a matter of some interest and surprise to the US Navy to see the heavy Banshee manage to routinely make successful landings on a flight deck that was over 100 feet shorter than that of an Essex. But the ship's role as a full-fleet carrier was unfortunately short-lived, with the 16 Banshees only lasting about 5 years before being removed in 1962, and the space left being used in part to give the hangar a bit of breathing space, and in part to increase the number of helicopters as the ship shifted over to purely anti-submarine warfare work. A year later, having been caught on the other side of the Atlantic during the Cuban Missile Crisis and having to hotfoot it back home, the ship would receive a refit as the H-04S helicopters were replaced by the much larger and more capable Sea King, and changes were needed to allow these to be operated and serviced aboard. At the same time, trials with the A-4 Skyhawk were carried out, but ultimately it was decided that it was more economical to stick with a pure anti-submarine warfare role for the carrier. During this period of her life, she would operate in cross-deck operations with a number of her sisters and half-sisters, including HMS Bulwark and HMNLS Carl Dorman, as well as serving as a troop transport for peacekeeping missions, this time in Cyprus, much as her predecessor had done in Egypt. An extensive refit to address a wide variety of issues began in 1966 and would last until the latter part of 1967. with Bonaventure rejoining the fleet just in time for the Royal Canadian Navy to cease to exist as an independent entity, as everything was merged into the Canadian Armed Forces and naval aviation came under the control of the Royal Canadian Air Force. The winces of sympathy from the fleet air arm could be felt across the Atlantic. Somewhat predictably, within a year of the merger, Bonaventure had been deemed surplus to requirements, and after a few wrapping up operations, she was decommissioned on the 3rd of July 1970 and broken up in 1971.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.